Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking into something, well, it's strange, but it's also really insightful.
Yeah, it's
The Church of Love.
okay.
Now, this wasn't your average Sunday service kind of church. It was a mail-order romance operation, and get this, it really took off. People all over the country were hooked.
It's wild, right?
Yeah, I mean, how could anyone fall for that?
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're going to try to figure out today.
All right.
We're going to be using excerpts from a book that really digs into this whole phenomenon. It connects it to psychology, even pulls in some pretty crazy historical examples. So get ready, because we're about to jump into the world of belief, deception, and you know that thing where you just can't let go of an idea even when it's clear you're wrong.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance.
Right. Cognitive dissonance. That's the one.
It's more common than you'd think.
I bet.
What makes the story so interesting is that it goes beyond just some weird scam, you know? It gets to the core of how we as humans handle those moments when we have to face facts that don't fit with what we believe. And you wouldn't believe the lengths we'll go to keep those beliefs intact.
Like our brains have this defense mechanism, right, to shield us from like uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. It's like a built-in system to reduce anxiety and keep a positive self-image. Cognitive dissonance is what we call it.
Yeah.
It's not always a bad thing, though. You know, it helps us to make sense of this crazy world. But as you'll see with this Church of Love thing, it can be used against us. And let me tell you, it can lead people down some pretty strange paths.
All right, so set the scene for us. Picture this. 1950 Chicago. You meet this seemingly ordinary housewife named Dorothy Martin, but she's claiming to be getting messages from another planet called Clarion. These messages, they're warning about an apocalypse, a giant flood that's going to wipe out Chicago on December 21st, 1955.
Oh, wow.
But here's the kicker. She says friendly aliens are coming in a UFO to rescue her followers right before the disaster hits.
Topic.
Now, a psychologist named Leon Festinger, he was intrigued by Martin's prophecy. He thought, okay, when this prophecy doesn't come true, her followers are going to experience some serious cognitive dissonance.
Right. Makes sense.
So to see this firsthand, he joins the group. He's expecting their faith to totally crumble when December 21st rolls around. And, surprise, surprise, no flood, no spaceship.
Oh, that's great.
Can you even imagine being in that room when midnight hits, everyone's still dry, and there's no alien rescue in sight?
Awkward.
Right.
You'd think that would be the end of it, but that's not what happened at all.
Oh, no.
Instead of admitting they were wrong, the most devoted followers just dug in deeper. They started saying their faith had actually prevented the flood. That's what led Festinger to really develop this theory of cognitive dissonance, that discomfort we feel when our beliefs don't match up with reality. And to deal with it, we often cling even tighter to what we believe, even twisting the facts to fit our story.
Okay, so fast forward a few decades, and we get to the Church of Love, the brainchild of a guy named Don Lowry.
Okay.
And this wasn't your typical church with sermons and hymns.
Right.
It was all mail order, targeting lonely men looking for a connection. Lowry, he created these whole backstories for these women he called angels. He wrote these really personalized letters to these guys, promising them love, companionship, even a utopian future in a place called, get this, Chandazah. Chandazah, yeah.
Interesting.
We got to get into the details here because these weren't just like generic storm letters.
Yeah.
Lowry, he went all out. Each angel had a personality that was like perfectly matched to what her target wanted. He even made up different handwriting for each one. He'd send gifts. There was this thing about sending a small pebble, and it was supposed to like symbolize the angel's love.
That's attention to detail.
Talk about dedication. It's like he was building a whole custom-made fantasy for each guy.
Yeah, that's exactly what he was doing.
And that's what made it so effective, right? These letters, they weren't just pieces of paper. They were like real, tangible hope, love, acceptance. The kind of things a lot of these men were really craving.
And they were getting it, you know, in a way.
Right. And now we got to talk about Joseph Enriquez. He's a really important part of this story.
Okay.
For years, he was in this, well, relationship with his angel Pamela. Countless letters, gifts. He got that pebble too, the whole 9 yards.
Wow.
And Joseph wasn't some hermit, you know. He had a life, a community, even a strong religious background. But this connection with Pamela, it filled a gap. It was this perfect love, and it felt real to him.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen.
Joseph's experience, it's actually kind of like The Truman Show.
Oh, how so?
Well, in the movie, Truman lives his whole life on a TV set. and he doesn't even know it.
Right.
It's all fake, the people, the town, everything. Someone's controlling every little thing.
Right.
And Joseph, it's like he was living in his own version of that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Pamela was at the center of it all. If he questioned if she was real, his whole world would fall apart. A world that gave him comfort, hope, made him feel like he belonged.
That's a powerful analogy.
But eventually, the line between Joseph's reality and the fantasy Lowry created, it just became impossible to ignore.
Right.
And that's where we really see the force of cognitive dissonance. Joseph finally gets to meet his beloved Pamela.
Yeah.
But guess what? He's not the only one there. There's a whole bunch of other men who also think they're the only one for her.
Oh, my God.
Imagine that. Your whole relationship, everything you believed in, suddenly turns out to be a lie.
It's got to be devastating.
So how does Joseph react?
Yeah.
Does he finally see the truth?
Well, that's the thing about cognitive dissonance. It's often easier to ignore the truth than to deal with losing something you really believe in.
Wow, so you're saying...
Think about it. If Joseph accepted the truth, he'd have to admit that years of his life, the love he felt, the hopes he had, were all based on a lie. That's a heavy thing to face.
Yeah, that's incredibly tough.
Uh-huh.
So instead of letting go of Pamela, he just holds on tighter.
Exactly. He comes up with all these reasons why the other guys are wrong. He says maybe they're just jealous. Or maybe there's some bigger purpose at play. He grasps at anything that lets him hold on to his beliefs, even if it means twisting the facts.
So it's like what we talked about with those followers of Dorothy Martin.
Yeah.
They found ways to rationalize the failed prophecy too, right? They didn't question, they just doubled down.
Exactly. It's a classic example of something we call belief perseverance. We hold on even tighter when the evidence says we should let go.
And then it all comes crashing down. The truth is out, and Don Lowry, along with the real Pamela, the woman actually writing the letters, end up in court.
They couldn't hide forever.
The prosecution presents a clear case of fraud and manipulation. But Lowry's lawyers, they come up with this really bizarre defense.
What do they say?
They call it the Santa Claus defense.
This is Santa Claus defense.
They argue that the Church of Love was basically just harmless fantasy, like believing in Santa, no big deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the prosecution hits back, saying this fantasy had very real consequences.
Right.
People had poured their life savings, their hopes and dreams into this made-up world.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets even more complicated. Some of the church members, they actually defend Lowry. They even testify for him in court.
Seriously.
This wasn't just a case of a few gullible people being tricked. The trial showed that there were all sorts of people involved.
Yeah.
Custodians, rocket scientists, you name it, all caught up in this web of lies.
It's amazing how many different types of people were drawn into this.
And their reasons for joining were different too. Some were lonely, some were looking for a place to belong, others were attracted to, like, the mystical side of the church, with rituals and this belief in Mother Maria's supernatural powers.
Mother Maria.
Yeah. It's like Lowry tapped into this deep human need for connection. He created this world, fake as it was, that gave people what they were missing.
It's kind of sad, really, but also fascinating.
And that's what makes this story so powerful. It shows how vulnerable we all are, the things we crave, and how far we'll go to protect our beliefs, even when the facts say we're wrong.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that anyone, no matter how smart or educated, can be fooled, especially when a scam promises to give us something we desperately need. Now, there's this guy, Ken Blanchard, a welder. He got really involved in the Church of Love. He wasn't just writing letters. He was taking part in all the rituals, believing he was, like, chosen.
Chosen for what?
He thought he'd have a special role in this Chandazab place. He put in a ton of money and even started living his life by the church's teachings.
Wow, he really bought into it all.
Totally. But what happens when he realizes it was all a lie?
Yeah. What then?
Total disillusionment. It wasn't just about the money. It was like losing a part of himself.
Right.
The beliefs that had given his life meaning, suddenly gone.
Tough.
And his story, it shows how deception hurts in ways that go beyond just finances. It shatters trust, crushes self-esteem, and the scars can last a long time.
Yeah.
And then there's Don Lowry, the architect of it all. Years after the trial, he's found living in a rundown house. It's a stark difference from the image of wealth and success he used to have.
Wow.
And guess what? He's surrounded by boxes full of stuff from the Church of Love. Letters, photos, even Mother Maria stuff. It's like a monument to his past.
He kept it all.
Like he couldn't let go. And in interviews, he talks about how much he enjoyed the power he had, how he could control people's lives.
That's kind of scary.
It's chilling, right? But did he ever say he was sorry for what he did?
Good.
Well, there are a few moments where he kind of hints at it. He says, for example, that a lot of members were smart enough to know the angels weren't real, but most of them just refused to believe it. He even admits that some people who knew it was a fantasy still sent him money. He saw it as their choice, like they were choosing to live in a fantasy, even if it meant losing everything.
That's harsh.
Right. But is there any regret, any acknowledgement of how this messed people up emotionally? There are times where he contradicts himself. He says maybe he should have been more honest, that he should have kept that disclaimer in the letters, the one that said they were made up.
Okay.
So it sounds like he knows he went too far. But then he turns around and says, even with the disclaimer, people would have believed what they wanted to believe anyway.
So he's shifting the blame.
Exactly. He's trying to make it their fault for believing.
Interesting.
And that brings us to his most famous line. They believed what they wanted to believe.
We've heard that one before.
Like he's saying, yeah, I created the lie, but they chose to buy it.
It's a way of acknowledging the power of belief, but also downplaying his part in it all.
And that's what makes this story so important, even today.
Yeah.
It makes us think about how we handle a world where it's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's fake.
Definitely.
The Church of Love might be gone, but the things that made it possible, loneliness, wanting easy answers, the desire for connection, those are still around.
They're everywhere.
We see it in how people stick to information that agrees with them, even if it's not true. We see it in scams that prey on our fears.
Absolutely.
It's like Lowry's legacy is still here, not in the leftover stuff from the church, but in how people are still being tricked, how their deepest desires are being used against them. So what have we learned from all this? How can we protect ourselves in a world that's getting more and more complex?
Well, the first thing is to be aware. We need to know our own biases, how our wants and fears can mess with our judgment.
And make us easy targets.
Exactly. We need to be careful about what we believe. Question the sources, look at the evidence, and be ready to change our minds when we learn new things.
So it's about being skeptical, but in a good way.
Right, yeah.
Not just assuming everything is a lie, but looking deeper, asking questions, getting different viewpoints.
That's it. And realizing that the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, is always better than holding on to a lie that makes you feel good. The Church of Love is a perfect example of how blind belief can be dangerous. But thinking critically, questioning things, that's what helps us deal with a complicated world.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, think about this. Be careful about what you believe, be curious, and be open to changing your mind. The best journey is the one that helps us understand ourselves and the world better.
I agree.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Church of Love. Last time, we were talking about how this whole mail-order romance operation got started and the psychology behind it, cognitive dissonance, that feeling you get when your beliefs clash with reality. We saw how Don Lowry basically built this fake world for lonely men who just want to connect with someone.
Yeah.
And then there was Joseph Enriquez, remember? His relationship with his angel, Pamela. It was like something straight out of the Truman Show.
It really was.
But even after the whole thing was exposed, Joseph, he still believed in Pamela. That's what we're going to pick up with today, how he dealt with all of that and what it tells us about how our hearts and minds work.
It's amazing how, even after everything came out, after Lowry was caught, Joseph still hung on to those memories of his relationship with Pamela.
Really?
Remember, he's still living in the same house where he got all those letters. The book describes it like a time capsule of this lost love. Pamela's presence is still all over the place.
He kept everything, the letters, the gifts.
All of it. Picture this. You walk into his house, and there's the lighthouse figurine she gave him, her photo, that pebble.
Yeah.
It's all there. Like he's treating them as precious relics from some special past.
That's wild. I'd be so angry if I were him. You're saying he doesn't hold any resentment?
Not at all. Instead of focusing on the deception, he seems to remember the comfort and hope Pamela gave him during a tough time in his life.
He was going through a divorce back then, right?
Yeah, and those letters were an escape for him, a world where love was pure and simple.
So are you saying the emotional support he got was more important than the actual truth of the situation? Like the connection he felt was stronger than the lie?
It shows how powerful our need for connection is. The need for love and companionship can be so strong that it overrides our common sense, leading us to believe things, even when the evidence says otherwise.
And remember, Joseph wasn't some loner, right? He was a devout Catholic, active in his community.
Exactly. He wasn't isolated or desperate for social contact.
So it's not just people who are lonely or isolated who fall for this kind of thing.
Right. It suggests that anyone, regardless of their background, can be drawn in by a story that promises to fulfill those deep emotional needs. There's this quote from Joseph in the book. We have this dream, of finding someone, falling in love, and everything being perfect. The Church of Love, it gave us that feeling.
That's kind of heartbreaking. It shows how much we all want love, that fairy tale ending, even when we know it's probably not going to happen.
And the Church of Love, it offered an escape from that reality, a fantasy where love was easy and without all the messiness of real relationships.
It makes you wonder if, for some people, the way they felt was more important than the truth. Like they chose to ignore the lie because it felt so good.
It raises some big questions about what belief really is and how our feelings influence what we think is real. This story reminds us that the line between fantasy and reality can get really blurry, especially when those fantasies tap into our deepest desires.
And that's why this story is so relatable, even now. It forces us to look at our own vulnerabilities, our own desires, and how we can be tricked into believing things.
Especially in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with information, stories, and online personalities that are all competing for our attention. Think about it. Social media feeds that show perfect lives, online dating profiles that promise the ideal match, algorithms designed to show us things that agree with what we already believe. We're all prone to creating our own versions of reality.
It's like we're living in a world of curated experiences, right? It's hard to know what's real and what's fake.
Exactly. And that's where the connections between the Church of Love and our own online lives get really interesting. Are we more likely to fall for this kind of stuff now that online connections and virtual communities are such a big part of our lives?
That's a good question. We have so much information available now, more than ever.
We do.
But then we also have all this misinformation, fake news, carefully crafted stories, and online profiles that might not even be real people. It's a tough situation.
It is, and that's why it's so important to think critically, to question things, and to be aware of the things that shape our perception. It's not about being cynical or distrusting everything online. It's about having a healthy level of skepticism, a willingness to look beyond the surface and see what's really going on.
Like we need to be smarter about the information we consume, both online and offline. Know our own biases and how they can affect our decisions.
Exactly. This brings us back to the core of what we've been talking about, the power of belief. Even when we see evidence that contradicts what we believe, we often cling to those beliefs anyway, especially if they give us comfort, meaning, or make us feel like we belong.
It's a good reminder that beliefs aren't always logical. They're often tied to our emotions, our values, who we think we are.
And that's why it's so crucial to understand the things that shape our beliefs, both internally and externally. Because in the end, the truth, even if it's hard to accept, is always more liberating than believing a lie, no matter how comforting it might be.
That's powerful. But before we wrap up this part, I want to go back to Don Lowry, the guy behind all this.
Okay.
What happened to him after the trial? Did he ever show any remorse for what he did?
That's exactly what we're going to look at in the final part of our deep dive. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the Church of Love. We've been through a lot, the psychology of belief, the whole mess of deception.
Yeah, we have.
But there's one guy we haven't really focused on yet, the guy who made it all happen, Don Lowry. Last time, we left off with him facing the consequences for his actions.
Yeah.
Now we're going to see what happened to him after the trial. Did he ever feel bad about what he did? Did he have any regrets?
Well, after that pretty dramatic escape from the authorities, he eventually ends up back in his hometown, Butler, Pennsylvania.
Huh.
Imagine that, going back to where it all started, only to find it's not the same anymore. Kind of like what happened to the Church of Love itself. The book describes Butler as this town struggling, Businesses closing, streets empty, like a symbol of lost hope.
It almost fits, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
The guy who built this fantasy world goes back to a place that's falling apart too. It's like the setting itself is showing us the consequences of his actions.
When researchers finally found him, he was living in this rundown house. It's a huge contrast to how he used to present himself, all wealthy and successful.
Oh, wow.
He was frail, like a shadow of his former self, surrounded by boxes and boxes of stuff from the Church of Love. Letters, photos, even things with Mother Maria on them. It was like a shrine to the past, a past he couldn't escape.
It's like he was trapped in a museum of his own bad choices, surrounded by these physical reminders of the people he hurt.
And yet you get this feeling that he's still clinging to it all, proud of what he built, but also haunted by what happened after. In interviews, he talks about how much he enjoyed the power, how he controlled people's lives.
That's pretty creepy. He knew he was manipulating people, playing on their weaknesses. But did he ever admit to causing them pain?
He did give some insight into what he was thinking. He said, there are a good number of members, intelligent people, who knew the angels weren't real. They accepted it as a fantasy. But most of them just completely refused to believe that these angels weren't real flesh and blood women.
That's just messed up. He knew he was creating a fantasy, and he still took advantage of people who wanted it to be real.
And he even said that some people who knew it was fake, they still sent him money. He saw it as their choice, their willingness to live in that fantasy, even if it meant losing everything.
That's cold. But was there any remorse? Any sign that he understood the emotional damage he caused?
There are moments where he seems conflicted. He admits that he should have been more honest, that he should have kept that disclaimer in the letters that said it was all made up. It seems like on some level he knew he crossed a line.
But then he turns around and says, even with the disclaimer, people would have believed what they wanted to believe anyway. It's like he's blaming them for being fooled.
Yeah, he tries to shift the responsibility, to say it was their choice to believe, even though he was the one pulling the strings.
And it all comes back to that one line he's known for. They believed what they wanted to believe.
Right.
He's acknowledging that people want to believe, need to believe, but he's also trying to minimize his role in manipulating them.
It's a complex thing. He understood that people crave belief, crave comfort and meaning, even in made-up worlds. And that's what makes this story so relevant, even today, you know?
Yeah.
It makes us think about how we deal with a world where it's becoming harder to separate what's real from what's not. The Church of Love might be gone, but those things that made it successful, loneliness, wanting easy answers, that need for connection, they haven't gone away. They're all around us.
We see it every day.
Think about those online groups where everyone just agrees with each other, even if what they're saying isn't true. Think about all the scams and fake news that prey on people's fears and anxieties. It's like Lowry's legacy is still alive, not in the physical stuff that's left over, but in how deception still works, how people's desires are still used against them.
So, after this deep dive into the Church of Love, what have we learned? What can we do to protect ourselves in this world that's getting more and more complicated?
The most important thing is to be aware. We need to recognize our own biases, how our own wants and fears can make us vulnerable to being manipulated. We have to be critical about what we believe, check the sources, look at the evidence, and be open to changing our minds when we learn new things.
So be skeptical, but not in a cynical way.
Right. Don't just assume everything's a lie, but dig a little deeper. Ask questions. Look for different perspectives.
And remember, the truth, even if it hurts, is always better than believing a lie, even if that lie makes you feel good. The Church of Love shows us how dangerous blind belief can be. But if we think critically, if we're willing to question things, we can navigate this crazy world a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Church of Love, remember, be careful about what you believe, be curious, and be willing to change your mind. The best journey is the one that helps us understand ourselves and the world a little better. And that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring,